You're listening to MuniCast, the podcast that discusses municipal leadership. Season 3 of MuniCast is brought to you by SaskTel's Innovation and Collaboration team. SaskTel can help you sort through the noise to create solutions that add value quickly, whether it's reducing your environmental footprint, driving investment, community development, or just saving money. Contact your SaskTel account manager to find out more. MuniCast is hosted by Suma, the voice of Saskatchewan's hometowns. I'm Stephanie, and joining me today is Don Iveson, former mayor of Edmonton. Don served as Edmonton's 35th mayor from 2013 to 2021, with a guiding leadership principle to make things better for the next generation. Since retiring from City Hall, Don continues to live in Edmonton. He works part-time with the Cooperators as executive advisor for climate investment and community resiliency, advising their CEO and senior leadership. Welcome, Don, and thank you for joining us for this episode of MuniCast.
Really glad to be here.
I wanted to start off our conversation today by learning a little bit more about you and your journey in municipal politics. You started at a young age and were elected to council when you were 28. What gave you the desire to enter municipal politics in your 20s?
It's a great question. I had done quite a bit of work with my community association, and I had also done some work professionally at the University of Alberta, working for undergraduate students as their government relations, policy and strategy researcher. And in that capacity, I did quite a bit of work around a transit project, which some people would know as a UPass, which is essentially purchase discount for post-secondary students at, in this case, a number of different post-secondary institutions in Edmonton on 3 different regional transit agencies, including Edmonton Transit. So it was actually quite a complex negotiation that taught me an awful lot about City Hall and regional governance and transit policy. And there was a housing crunch at the time in 2005, 2006 here in Edmonton. And so I was starting to think about land use and housing affordability and how transit could help people make different choices and move around their city differently, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, so on and so forth. So I was already starting to think quite a bit about city planning issues at that time. And then my work on some of that led more than a few people to suggest, we really could use that kind of thinking on city council. You should think about running. And so I was asked and invited and prodded by some people whose opinion I took seriously. But I think it actually started a few years before that in a project called Canada 25, which did a few years of public policy roundtables on a couple of different topics. And it was a bunch of retired student leaders. So I had a background in student press, and lots of friends of mine were students' union leaders from across the country. And they all used to love, just like folks like going to FCM and SUMA and Municipalities Alberta conferences, these student leaders missed those conferences when they got together and stayed up all night, tried to solve the problems of the world in the hallways after doing the policy work. And so they started this project called Canada 25 with some fairly serious corporate and philanthropic support to bring emerging, younger Canadian leaders recently graduated together to tackle big problems. The first year they looked at brain drain, which was a big issue, sort of 2000, 2001. And then one of the things that they found out of the brain drain was that we just weren't building competitive Canadian cities that, frankly, young people wanted to stay in. There was no sort of intention around that. The final report out of this Canada 25 process was written by a guy named Naheed Nenshi, who you may know as the mayor of Calgary, and represented a bit of a playbook for a lot of the kinds of things that younger leaders were bringing to city halls across the country. And he and I were both kind of working from that same playbook, and it's still out there available on the web if people want to Google it.
That's incredible. It sounds like you've been really involved in your community, even as a student, and seeking that insight into what the community needs and where you can start putting in your efforts to help improve that. What would you say were some of the biggest challenges that you faced and some of the biggest opportunities?
Well, initially, when I set out, the stereotypical city councillor in most communities, including Edmonton, was someone late in their career. And that was sort of the expectation. You need to be late in career and have certain experience to be a city councillor, a steward of leadership in the city. It was odd to have a younger person running, but I'm pleased to tell you that that's really changed over the last 15 years or so. When I got on council, the average age of our council, even with me in my 20s, was still in its 60s. And when I left, I was at 42, older than the average age of the incoming council. So that's really two generation shifts happening in less than the time of a generation. And so I was the first of a crop of young leaders stepping up, but initially that, was a lot of patting on the head. Oh, isn't this nice to see young people stepping forward and running, and, stick with it. After 2 or 3 elections, maybe you'll get on council. So there was, a lot of, I think, well-meaning underestimation. But then I went out there and knocked on tens of thousands of doors and worked really hard and was articulating things that were relevant, not just to my generation, but to parents of folks in my generation who were concerned about housing affordability for their kids, mobility for their kids, creating reasons for their kids to want to stay in Edmonton, and also basic questions of sustainability that we were still just learning to talk about in the context of cities and climate change, air quality, water quality, sustainable land use. I was talking about those things, and it turns out people were, had a sense, just as regular people, that City Hall needed to be thinking more long-term in its planning, and having the perspective of someone who was actually going to be around for that long-term would be a positive addition to our city council. So youth started out as a bit of a disadvantage and became an advantage.
That's really interesting that it started out as a disadvantage and then took you into an advantage and was able to get you on the same line of sight as a couple of different generations when it comes to the younger generation as well as their parents looking for ways to support them. Communities are electing younger municipal officials, and that's become increasingly more common. What do you think some of the reasons for that are?
I think there's a mix of push and pull factors. I think that the scale of issues that we're all dealing with, particularly around the environment and climate change, which are generational issues, and also income inequality and how that shows up in the housing market and housing affordability. These are questions which, no matter what stage of life you're at, you can start to see how either you may have had it different and much better earlier in life if you're an older person. And also young people are taking a huge interest in understanding some of the challenges that lie ahead for them, whether it's a pathway to affordable home ownership, or whether it's the risks and challenges presented by climate, or even fundamental questions about the state of our democracy and taking ownership and leadership over it. So those are some of the pull factors in terms of issues that I think resonate across the board for motivated voters and candidates to consider ensuring that there is some youth and some diversity. But in terms of sort of push factors for younger candidates to be choosing particularly local government, I've been watching a trend and talking to folks coming up kind of behind me, and I mentor a number of young leaders in Edmonton and elsewhere. And the resonance for them, and this is not to speak ill of folks who run provincially or federally. I have admiration for anyone who puts themselves out there electorally. But the number of people who are finding an opportunity to provide non-polarizing leadership, or even to think, we've all had an education the last few years about how important it is to not just be not racist, but to be anti-racist actively, right? And I think that in our politics and what's happening in our democracy right now, I'm a big believer that it's not good enough to just not contribute to polarization. We need to actually do our best when we can to be anti-polarizers. And I think local government, being inherently nonpartisan, being closer to the people, just physically, even the way we sit in fluid and flexible coalitions of people sitting often in a semicircle, that just the whole system is much more conducive to anti-polarizing leadership. That I think a generation of leaders are drawn to that, and who would not choose provincial or federal partisan politics, but who see have a desire to serve and a desire to make their community better, and see a much safer and more productive venue for that leadership and service at the local level.
People do go into municipal politics because they get to be closer to the people that they are working with and working for. And earlier this year, when you provided a keynote speech for SUMA at our annual convention, you talked about the importance of meeting people and building relationships so you can better serve the people that elect you. While elected, what were some of the ways that you continued to connect with the citizens of Edmonton?
I'll be the first to say that that gets harder after your first election, when you go from being, the outsider who doesn't wear the record of the established council to now being a member of the council, and ultimately, especially if you're the mayor, people then tend to sort of, especially if they have a gripe, associate with the city at all, that then you are, the vessel for that gripe. So the relationship does change when you're elected, but there's no substitute for knocking on doors of the people who you want to serve in the first instance. I still think that's the best way to get elected. A lot of people will spend an awful lot of time on social media strategies to try to win elections. And I think you have to have one. They're table stakes, but there's still no substitute for actually going out and introducing yourself to people. And even more importantly, listening to what their concerns are, what their hopes and aspirations are. So once have made the transition from outside to inside, maintaining the perspective and engagement of citizens, I saw that change. I was one of those very eager early adopters of Twitter before it turned into whatever it is now, because I thought it was one of those places where we're really going to have the virtual town square of ideas and exchange of information and good faith questions with good faith answers. And it is a long way from that now. So I thought technology was going to play a big role in that, and it still does. But the City of Edmonton, and this became more and more important, because once you're the mayor, no one really tells you the truth to your face, right? It really is an emperor has no clothes situation. Now, what people don't realize is that you also have ears in many, many rooms. And so when people are smack talking, that gets back to the mayor too. So it's a little bit sobering that way, but all the more reason to have really effective mechanisms to collect public sentiment, besides obviously reading the newspaper and watching social media, but really getting directly to people in more unfiltered ways. So the City of Edmonton's public engagement policy was updated and got international recognition for doing something as simple as rewriting the policy. People would know the IAP2 guidelines for how to do public engagement, but they're all written from the perspective of the public engagement practitioner and the end user of that information. But we had a sort of citizen panel that worked with some of our city councilors to do a policy review of that. And one of the most elegant things they did was turn it around and rewrite the policy from the perspective of the citizen, so that it was, what is the citizen's expectations of varying degrees of public engagement? Are they the deciders in the case of a referendum or direct democracy exercise, or are they receiving information and providing comment? And so then implementing that, rewriting the policy is actually relatively easy. Honoring a policy like that in a really democratic and open way, knowing that you can't please everybody by definition, that was really critical for us, and I think meant rich and engaged listening to our public on major decisions. And then one of the other things that we did that worked really well was we set up a standing citizen panel, and I think there were 5,000 or 6,000 Edmontonians, and they were by design more engaged citizens. So it wasn't a random sample, but it was people who were really interested in what was going on in the city, who self-identified and then were willing to take surveys that the city would put out periodically about pressing issues that were coming forward. And then sometimes we would get a poll done or a survey done of a representative sample of Edmontonians. And also it was really interesting to see sometimes what the difference was between generalized sample of Edmontonians and the sort of self-selected hyper-engaged group of Edmontonians. And usually, unless there was something really extraordinary going on, it wasn't wildly out of proportion. So what we learned was that we were able to use that citizen panel routinely to get a good sense of where Edmontonians were at on issues, and also test ideas with them too, and say, well, if we explain it like this, so we could do focus grouping and all kinds of things with this online panel. It became a tremendously useful tool to understand where an engaged sample of Edmontonians was.
I think that's a really interesting point that you highlighted there, is that there is still the importance for the social media platform and the online present, but it's really the legs for the full table. Nothing can quite compare to going out, knocking on doors, and getting to know the citizens directly. And I'm really curious about how doing that, going out and meeting the citizens, as well as having your community panel, what that did to help connect to your community better, to understand the health of the community as a whole, and what role compassion played in all of that.
Well, it's really easy if you've got good digital tools to just rely on those. So, I think for me, it was still really important to get out into community. And this got so much harder to do during the pandemic for everybody. But it was just as important for me to connect with communities that didn't have high online participation, because of economic conditions, digital divide, or just straight up houselessness. You couldn't expect to have longitudinal engagement from individuals who needed the services of their community the most. Being present with, and even just at the most basic level, being curious about, and with compassion about the experience of marginalization, the experience of racism, the experience of being ostracized within community because of addictions and mental health challenges, and trying to maintain a sense and connection to the humanity of all Edmontonians, including the folks who are struggling the most in our community. That you have to get up close for. And, so making sure that our in-person engagements, supplementing the digital work that we were doing, included people with lived experience from diverse communities, meant that not only the elected officials, but also the municipal workers and the fellow citizens had the opportunity, ideally, to hear from folks who were struggling in community, because it's easy to get high engagement, high participation from people who earn well, who feel safe, who are employed, who generally feel secure in the community. But the bias of those people is that things are generally going well, right? And for those for whom it is not going well, it's critically important to go out of your way to understand what their experience is. And particularly now, we understand that in Canada and on the prairies, particularly through a lens of reconciliation and intergenerational trauma in the context of broader colonization and anti-racism and community safety. And so, but fundamentally, it's about humanizing all the folks who are in your community. And, as leaders, I think it's very easy to play to your base and play to the folks who vote and play to the folks who show up. But it's, our responsibility is broader to that. Our oath is not just to the people who voted for you, and not even just to the people of your district in a ward system, but it really is to the whole community, including especially those people who may be struggling. So making sure that their voices are included in decision making, and not being afraid to hear sometimes very harsh feedback. They may be very right that the system has failed them, and many systems, and folks don't always distinguish between roles of the different orders of government. And cities and local governments take a lot of heat for what I regard as policy failures of our country and of our provinces and of our society. But there has to be an outlet for that, and the minute it's not compassionate, the minute it's infused with judgment or defensiveness, and I've done both, the minute we stop maintaining the kind of open-heartedness that's necessary to do really complicated work in community.
Across the province, SaskTel is engaged with many different municipal organizations who seek to innovate. Contact your SaskTel account manager to learn more about some of these initiatives and how they can help your municipality today.
I really liked how you touched on the fact that the people who are already engaging with the city are the ones that are usually things are going well and they are ready to be there and have those conversations. But a lot of the time, who we want to hear from are the people who don't have the capacity necessarily to engage with you and to be part of those conversations. And so, when addressing community mental health, and you already spoke to this a little bit, we've heard the phrase a lot. It's important to meet people where they're at. Is that a philosophy that you agree with? And what does that mean to you? And what are some ways that you would have implemented it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first that I think, I've never seen it so bad. And I don't just mean for folks who are, draw a lot on municipal services or who are struggling with extreme deprivation and inequality. I think, it's a really timely question because, we see it in our organizations. I saw it in our workforce at the city after 2 years of pandemic and virtual work and budget constraints. At one point in the city here, we had over 4,000 people on temporary layoff because we had facilities closed and because we weren't sure about our financial situation. These were very desperate times. And not just for municipal governments, most organizations, most households, and then especially for people who are already struggling. So understanding that everybody's in pretty tough shape right now, I think is kind of an important first principle right now. Like decision makers, I've never seen leaders as stressed out. It took me months to realize how burnt out I was after stepping down as mayor. And people said, why didn't you run again? And there's all kinds of reasons, but on some level, I knew how worn out I was. And yet there's lots of other people, especially frontline workers, who never got a break during this. So all just to say, like, we all got to do that, I think, to get through this. And challenges with that are leading to, some eruptions of behavior that really are tough to stomach. And then folks who had the most challenges to begin with are in even worse shape than they were before. So I think it's as important as it has ever been to meet people where they're at, which is that, I don't know anyone who's had 365 good days in a row in a given year, right? So everyone's struggling. And I certainly struggled. And so peer support became incredibly important. Like the work that I was doing with the big city mayors through the pandemic, as sort of weekly calls that we had with the federal government. I mean, those were very important, literally disaster response engagements that we had. And we tried to provide some feedback to the federal government about everything from supports for small business to transit restart to gaps in housing and the ability of vulnerable people to isolate. And then also, practically speaking, support for municipalities of all scales in responding to the budget challenges. But there were also, a chance to connect with peers who were going through similar issues with their organizations. So, in general terms, we kind of had to look out for each other a little bit. So then at a community level, on the one hand, there is a lot of anger right now, and justifiably so. I try to see in the context of the struggles that people have and the absence of or depletion of resources that many people have. But we're seeing behavior out there in community, especially at the acute end for, the downtowns of all of our larger cities and a lot of mid-sized centers as well, have never seen this kind of disorder in our lifetimes. The economic stresses people are under, and then the mental health stresses people are under, and then add in addictions challenges on top of that, and then add in that the substance drug poisoning has led to a variety of different things where, what people were self-medicating with 10 or 20 or 30 years ago in our downtowns is very different from what people are taking now. I mean, these are real issues and they're very, very challenging. But starting from the premise that these are human beings who are suffering is still important for me, because the minute we, or decision makers or the public discourse, dehumanizes human beings who are suffering in our cities and treats them like a problem or from a place of judgment. And it's hard not to go there. It's hard not to go there if the window of your business got smashed out, or your car got broken into, or your daughter doesn't feel safe going to school or using transit. So it's really hard to climb out of our tendency to judge. So that's all back to your question. Like, that's where a lot of people are at. And the other thing that I try to remember is that most of us are a couple of tragedies away from that. And so for me, some of the most meaningful experience is understanding that it's not that, I'm morally better and that's why I'm not on the street. It's that I was really lucky where I was born. I was really lucky not to be born with a predisposition towards serious mental illness or addictions. I was really privileged to be born in a house that was very nurturing and not a violent or scary place, and that it doesn't take much, along with losing your job and a whole bunch of other tragedies that can happen to people late in life, for people to wind up in those very, very difficult situations. And so that's what meeting people where they're at is understanding that there's a whole journey of personal and societal tragedies that unfolded to get someone to that place. And, as a community, we've got to act to support people and start with where they're at too. So that means housing first. That means, addictions policy that doesn't immediately presume abstinence before you can get additional help. That means a variety of tough choices for policymakers. But inaction on these, judgment on these, leaving them to fester in our cities, and then blaming the cities as if they caused these challenges, that's an unfortunate game of politics that's unfolded in a number of Canadian provinces, particularly on the prairies, that I think it isn't making conditions better for people to feel safe, isn't making conditions better for business and investment. It sure as hell isn't making healthcare and justice any more cost effective. So I think if we started with where people are at, we'd get to a different place faster.
I think that was a really important point that you made about how we are not that far off from being in that position. A lot of it is where we were born into and the luck that we've had throughout our lives. And for a lot of people, it can take only a few bad things, having a car breakdown, losing your job at the same time before you can end up in a very similar situation. What changes do you think need to be made to the way that we work to better address some of those really big issues that seem to be consistently affecting communities on a large scale?
Well, I maybe just add one more thought to what we were just talking about, which is, I had an experience that was really, and it took me years to make meaning out of this, and I think I'm still coming to terms with it on some level, which is that my best friend from big chunks of secondary school, grew up in a privileged and affluent neighborhood, middle class parents, and this very good friend of mine was often the life of the party, but he wound up in a battle with mental health, and I never got a label or an explanation, but he was struggling. He self-medicated and went down a journey that included 10 years on the streets of Edmonton at the same time that I was at City Hall. And I literally stepped over him once, just outside of City Hall. And he was down and out on the street. And so for me, I kind of have that up close and experience of knowing someone who ran in the same circle as me very, very tightly, who wound up in very difficult circumstance, and who reported to me later when I saw him when he was doing much better, that the city's approach to housing first had, in his words, saved his life. And I still get emotional thinking about it because, that was obviously pretty up close personal testimony, sample size of one, but the evidence around providing housing and shelter for folks while they also have wraparound services brought in, challenge their mental health challenges, their other human needs. The longer someone is street involved, and depending on their individual circumstances, if there isn't a community or a family to go back to for whatever reason, the more that housing is critical. And there's a big debate right now, but the key is that it's not just a roof and see you later. It's got to be integrated wellness supports and culturally safe supports for people. So for example, faith-based programs work really well for people who have that faith anchor from their childhood. But if the faith anchor in their childhood was a trip to residential schools, that is not going to be safe. And so culturally appropriate supportive housing with 24/7 healthcare support while they are dealing with untreated mental health and drug circumstances. Without those supports, of course the housing gets trashed. Of course people wind up back out on the street. Of course people go back to their addictions or have their dealer come in and crash at their place. So you can't just, put people in a motel and declare victory and say that you've ended that person's homelessness. You've maybe abridged it very shortly, but this is where the emphasis on supportive housing in the supports themselves is, I think, the critical gap. And Medicine Hat is often cited as one of those places that has achieved this goal of ending chronic homelessness. People still become homeless, but they're rapidly rehoused. And then their agencies are really, really good at providing people very effective supports to stay housed and achieve recovery, or at least management of their addictions, and achieve a degree of healing with respect to mental health challenges and trauma. And that's why they've been so successful. So you have to really stick with it, and you have to fund the supports properly. And then for better or for worse, some of Medicine Hat's toughest cases don't stay in Medicine Hat. They wind up in Edmonton and Calgary. So there is an extra load, and the most severe and complex cases often wind up in the big cities. So some, asymmetrical investment is needed because those folks didn't all come from Edmonton and Calgary, but it's or Regina or Saskatoon, but it's often kind of the last resort place. And so providing an effective intervention of not just a roof and not just some programming, but a sense of some community that's supportive of that individual's recovery and healing. It's hard to do. It's not cheap, but it's way cheaper than leaving the problem to the status quo, which is this revolving door of engagement with the health system and return trips to incarceration, all of which have a much higher cost than doing supportive housing properly. So I still think that proper supportive housing is one of the most, with recovery and deep mental health support, culturally safe support, is still the missing piece of the puzzle to turning this around in our in communities of all sizes, but especially in the big cities.
I think that's a really important highlight that you made there about how it is very much about getting a roof over somebody's head so that they have that safety and that ability to go forward and continue doing what they need to do with their lives. But that if there aren't any follow-up supports and resources for them, it is very difficult for people to keep doing that, and how important that is for supporting people through the future and with those programs like that. Another thing that you mentioned too is how in Medicine Hat, a lot of their more difficult cases end up going to some of the larger municipalities. And Medicine Hat itself is still a larger municipality. For smaller communities, what role do you see regionalization and collaboration having in supporting people who are trying to get help for mental health and addictions?
Well, I think it's critical. I think you make a good point, and this example really illustrates it well. That human systems, and whether we're talking about labor markets and commuter patterns, or whether we're talking about addictions and mental health journeys, these are borderless. So solutions need to be borderless as well. And we often would discuss at the Northern Alberta Mayors and Reeves Caucus the equal importance of housing interventions, on First Nations and in smaller towns in the north, so that folks had a place to either return to or not leave in the first place. And so that we needed to take sort of a systems level approach to regional planning and meeting the gaps in the housing system. I would love to see the right 1,000 in Edmonton and the right 500 elsewhere that help, manage, folks closer to home and support them closer to home so that they don't wind up kind of down and out in the big city at the end of it. And that if you took that, regional planning approach to acute needs in housing and mental health and addictions and corrections and community safety, you could spare the city a lot of what is the load of the failure of the system today by investing upstream. And it would probably be more efficient. So in principle, I totally agree with that argument. We're just at the point now where we're so far behind in the big cities with a generational or really intergenerational problem, that's where a lot of the attention is focused. But I think if, really starting from the premise that helping people heal quickly from the turmoil of life, and they're going to be able to do that so much better closer to home, especially land-based programming that's culturally appropriate and safe and inviting for Indigenous community members. That all of that's going to be way more successful and cost effective as prevention and early intervention than response to chronic unmet need. And so again, you probably need to do both. Otherwise, you're just going to get really good at pulling people out of the river rather than learning how to keep them from falling into the river upstream. Easy to say, hard to do. We keep, as humans and as policymakers, failing the marshmallow test over and over. But the other issue is, that it's really easy because it's systemic and because it's regionalized to just play jurisdictional pass the buck and blame somebody else for the failure. And I've done my fair share, and I think there's a case to be made of calling out the government of Alberta for gaps in their response to this at this systemic level. And past a certain point, that's not actually serving anybody. We do need to figure out what actions are we going to take. But yes, to your point, I think you got to have an end-to-end urban and rural response to helping people where they're at. And the more we were able to do that, not just with their mental health, but literally, location-wise meeting them where they're at, I think the system would work a lot better than it does right now.
You've really highlighted how complicated that a lot of this can be, and just how many different factors there are that play into it. And you've brought up the different levels of government a few times and citizens. And so there's just, so many different things that go in and play into each other to create these situations. And it's not going to take just one person in order to be able to address all of them either. I want to shift gears a little bit for our last question here. You had mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation how difficult moving through the pandemic and being on council for those several years had been, and the point of burnout that you reached. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you did to support yourself and how groups like the Big City Mayor's Caucus helped support you through those times. Well,
I was really fortunate to have a couple members of City Council who, it's being the mayor is a little bit out on your own, but which is why that peer network of other big city mayors doing comparable jobs was so valuable, just because, something was coming up, or just the load we were all bearing kind of as chronic stress, just being able to validate that for each other and talk a little bit about what we were doing, what we were reading for either technical background or, a lot of knowledge sharing, but then even at the level of like, how are you looking after yourself? Are you doing okay? So that sort of basic mental health first aid for each other, and solidarity that, this is really hard. This is tough. That was kind of table stakes essential. And then, a little bit more regularly and deeply with a couple members of my city council, was able to have pretty frank conversations about how we were doing and kind of, more vulnerable conversations, trusting conversations, a conversation I wouldn't necessarily had with my whole council, and I wouldn't have had it with the microphone on, I wouldn't have had it in public, but particularly with the stresses our organization was going through, being able to check in with each other and share some resources, even just, when we were all working virtually, getting together and going for a walk, just to maintain that human connection, because that alienation from each other, that sense of apartness, starts to eat away at trust, the weak social bonds that hold communities together and even hold, organizations or groups like a board or a council together. So just trying to maintain that connection really deliberately with people. And, I started listening to a lot more podcasts. It was one of those paradoxical things where I went from working 90 hours a week to more like 60. And I've never worked as hard in my life or felt as much load in that 60, but I had the other 30 back to spend a lot more time with my kids, and to, look after my physical health a little bit better, or try to anyway. And then, tend to, my wellness as a person, which was tough. And it's not scale dependent. I mean, I think talking to other mayors from communities of all sizes, urban and rural, and we all felt that on behalf of our community, on behalf of the people we worked with and served with. I worked with a coach, and that became essentially therapy along the way. Just prioritizing, even just acknowledging how much stress I was under as a leader, and then carving out space to reflect on that, to journal a lot, to seek solidarity and advice from peers. And then also to check in with my colleagues too and make sure that they were okay. And at any given time, one of us wasn't. So that was critically important. And I remember that in the first year of the pandemic, there was a lot more conversation about isolation and mental health and the effects of chronic stress. And I was one of those people really hoping that we were going to be talking about that more after the pandemic. And unfortunately, you don't see that conversation as much, though I think the tone shifted. And I think the next generation is much more comfortable talking about mental health in the context of organizational dynamics. And I mean, I think you can put a mental health lens on a lot of the discord in our country and in the world right now, which is not all related to the pandemic, but that certainly made it worse. So, I mean, I guess trying to maintain perspective was the big challenge. But I think the bottom line is nobody can do that alone, right? We all need support systems. We all need resources. We all need tools. And sometimes we need professional help for those things. And I'm glad that I had those resources going in. I recognize a lot of people didn't.
So that's something that you've highlighted a lot throughout our conversation today, was just the importance of connection, whether it was on a personal level or a community level, or even just amongst your own council. That has been something that we've heard a lot about throughout the pandemic, and especially coming out of it, is that need for connection and really coming together again and being able to be with one another. So that brings me to the end of my questions for today. And I really just wanted to thank you for having this conversation with me. I really appreciated hearing more about your insights, your experiences, some of your personal experiences and professional ones. And thank you very much for being here.
Well, my pleasure. And just maybe on a final thought, our communities are where we are most likely to find that connection, beyond our immediate family and beyond our workplace. So I think it's just so important that we, as leaders in community, elected and otherwise, work to create conditions that foster that connection with people, rather than othering or judging or losing that connection to our fellow human beings. There aren't really bad people. There's just bad behavior. And the minute we start to see someone as bad at their core because of a behavior that is arguably deplorable, and we can judge the behavior, but once we judge the person and write them off, we've lost that connection. And I get why that's happening nationally. I get why it happens politically in the partisan space. I get why it happens in professional sports, but it can't happen at the level of our towns and our villages and our cities. We've got to hang together and save community there. And that's where, the work of local leaders is so important. I was privileged to get to do it for 14 years, but very, very happy to have the chance here to share just a few thoughts about, and gratitude to all the people who continue to do this work during a very difficult period in our history at the local level, where that bond of community and connection can and should be the strongest. So thanks to everyone who's listening, who's doing this work every day.
This brings us to the end of another episode of MuniCast. Thank you for tuning in to Season 3. We hope you enjoy it as much as we have enjoyed having these conversations. Join us for Episode 2, where we will be speaking with SUMA's President and Councillor for the City of Yorkton, Randy Golden.